The fog had rolled over the forest like a living thing, swallowing the treetops and muffling the distant rumble of artillery that never truly ceased during those suffocating days encircling Bastogne. Snow clung to every branch and stone with a stubbornness that mirrored the men trapped within that frozen pocket of the Ardennes. Men who had long forgotten the feeling of warmth or certainty or anything beyond the relentless punch of cold that wormed its way beneath their uniforms and into their bones. In the outskirts of the battered town, near a cluster of improvised repair tents patched together from torn canvas and frozen hope, a line of prisoners stood under guard, their breaths merging with the mist. Among them was a young German mechanic named Friedrich Adler, who had been captured only 48 hours earlier during a confused firefight near a clogged forest road, where white camouflage sheets failed to hide the terror in the eyes of boys asked to die for a Reich had already begun to collapse beneath its own Friedrich kept his head low as he shuffled forward with the other prisoners, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from the bitter cold that gnawed relentlessly at his fingers, the fingers that had once known only the soft warmth of motor oil and the comforting weight of tools, rather than the metallic slick of blood that came with war's cruel apprenticeship. He had been a civilian mechanic before conscription, a quiet man with a gift for listening to engines the way others listened to symphonies, hearing in their stutters and rattles a language he had come to love. War had twisted that gift into something darker, forcing him to nurse the steel monsters that hauled death rather than rescued life. And now, as he stood enveloped by the muffled groans of wounded and the distant crack of tank guns echoing through the winter air, he wondered if God had abandoned the Ardennes entirely, or merely stepped aside to let men tear one another apart. Inside the repair tent, American mechanics huddled around the gutted belly of a Sherman tank, whose engine had frozen, starved of fuel pressure, its lines clogged by the viscous gel that the cold created far faster than their limited supplies could manage. 20 Shermans lay scattered across the grove like wounded beasts, their crews pacing anxiously around them, or crouching beside small fires as if begging the flames to awaken the steel giants that were their only hope of holding back the armoured fist tightening around Bastogne. The men were exhausted, hollow-eyed, and working with tools that froze to their hands, yet they laboured on, refusing to yield because surrendering the town meant slicing open the entire Allied advance and delivering it to the enemy's last desperate gamble. One of the American sergeants noticed Friedrich staring at the Shermans with an expression that was less hatred and more recognition, and perhaps because the lines between enemy and necessity blur in moments when survival steals precedence over ideology, he dragged the young German forward and growled a question the prisoner only half understood but entirely recognized. "Can you fix this?" Friedrich hesitated, unsure whether offering knowledge to the enemy would condemn him later, or if withholding it would damn him sooner. But then he saw the desperation in their faces and felt the old instinct awaken, the one that cared more for engines than for flags. Carefully, with slow gestures so as not to provoke the rifles trained upon him, he knelt beside the exposed engine and traced the fuel lines with numb fingers, listening to the quiet tick of cooling metal as though it were a heartbeat struggling to continue its rhythm. He murmured in broken English that the fuel itself was the enemy now, thickened by the brutal cold, trapped in lines too wide to maintain pressure and too stiff to warm quickly. He explained that in his unit, when conditions grew harsh and supplies grew thin, they learned a crude and risky trick taught by an old mechanic who had survived the Russian front, narrowing the flow by inserting a tightened copper sleeve into the line, forcing the gelled fuel through a restricted path that increased pressure and kept the engine alive. It was inelegant, dangerous, and very likely to make the engines run hotter than they should. But the alternative was 20 tanks frozen into useless monuments, while German armour closed in from every direction. The Americans exchanged bewildered glances, then curiosity, then the unmistakable spark of hope that ignites when all other solutions have failed. Friedrich offered no guarantees, only the solemn truth that engines, like men, sometimes needed a desperate measure to keep moving when winter tried to claim them. And as the sergeant barked orders to fetch copper tubing, heated tools, and the materials Friedrich described, the German prisoner stood there shivering, unsure whether he had just saved lives or prolonged the agony of a war he no longer believed in, yet unable to suppress the faint warmth that flickered inside him as he realized that for the first time in months he had done something simply because it was right. The morning broke slowly, like a reluctant confession. A dim light seeped through the frozen mist, turning the white wasteland around Bastogne into a haunting landscape of silence and smoke. The repair yard was a graveyard of metal, a place where the frozen carcasses of Sherman tanks waited for a resurrection that seemed impossible. Yet, amidst the chaos of war, something strange was stirring, not the thundering echo of artillery, but the fragile rhythm of hope, measured by the tapping of tools against metal. The American mechanics, faces blackened by soot and exhaustion, worked under the whispered guidance of the captured German, Friedrich Adler. His words came hesitantly, broken by cold and language, but his hands moved with a clarity that transcended every barrier. He had drawn diagrams in the snow using the blunt end of a wrench, illustrating how a piece of copper tubing, scavenged from a wrecked fuel truck, could be narrowed and fitted into the fuel line. The principle was simple, almost primitive, yet born of necessity. Compress the flow, increase the pressure, keep the fuel from gelling. The Americans watched, skeptical at first, their pride bristling at the idea of learning from a man who, days ago, had worn the uniform of the enemy. But desperation dulls the edge of pride, and when death lurks in the snow, survival becomes the only allegiance that matters. They worked in silence, their breath fogging the air as they heated small pieces of copper over campfires, bending and crimping them with makeshift tools. The forest around them crackled with the sound of artillery in the distance, each explosion a reminder that time was running out. If the tanks didn't move soon, Bastogne would fall. The town had already become a symbol, a stubborn defiance carved into the heart of the winter offensive, and every man there, soldier or prisoner, knew they were holding the line not just for themselves, but for something larger, for the idea that this frozen forest would not become their grave. Friedrich guided the sergeant as they installed the first modified line. The copper sleeve gleamed faintly in the dim light, a fragile promise against the machinery's brutality. When they tried to start the engine, the first attempt failed, the starter coughing like an old man too weak to rise. The second try brought only silence and disappointment, but on the third, there came a low, reluctant growl, the sound of life returning. The engine sputtered, choked, and then roared awake, a thunder that made the men cheer aloud, their voices echoing through the trees. Some laughed, others simply stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. A Sherman that had been pronounced dead was breathing again. Words spread like fire through the camp. Men came running, dragging cables and fuel lines, shouting for the Kraut mechanic to look at their tanks too. Friedrich stood among them, dizzy from the sudden attention, his breath quick and uneven. He had not felt like a man for months, only a tool in someone else's war, and now, against all sense and logic, he was being treated as something else, a savior of machines, and by extension, of lives. The sergeant clapped him on the shoulder and barked orders for more lines, more copper, more everything. Even the guards began to look at him differently, their suspicion tempered by grudging respect. By midday, 4 more Shermans roared to life, their engines coughing up black smoke that mingled with the cold air. Each one was a victory against the frost, against despair, against the invisible noose tightening around Bastogne. The men began to move faster, shouting over the din of hammers and roaring engines. Friedrich watched them, his hands blistered and raw, his face smeared with oil and soot. For a fleeting moment, he forgot who wore which uniform. All he saw were men fighting not for ideology, but for survival. The tanks, once silent hulks of frozen steel, now lined up like beasts awakening after a long slumber, ready to defend the town that refused to die. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the forest came alive with the deep growl of 20 engines turning in unison. The sound rolled through the frozen valley like the beating heart of something vast and unstoppable. Soldiers who had not smiled in days stood and watched, their faces lit by fire and exhaust, realizing that they had just been handed a second chance. In that moment, the line between enemy and ally blurred completely. Just men, machines, and a shared defiance against the cold hand of death. Friedrich stood apart, shivering but strangely warm inside. He had given them his knowledge, his craft, his quiet rebellion against despair. And though he was still a prisoner, something in him had broken free. Somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the smoke and the sound of engines, a distant artillery shell burst against the horizon, scattering sparks into the night. The war was not over, far from it, but for the first time, there was light in the darkness, and it came not from gunfire, but from ingenuity and courage born in the heart of a frozen enemy. If you're still here and feeling the story rise with these men, make sure to subscribe. More incredible moments like this are coming in the next parts of the saga. The next dawn came red, painted not by the sun, but by the flames devouring the horizon. Bastogne was no longer merely a town on a map. It had become a heartbeat trapped between the steel jaws of two armies, each desperate, each exhausted, neither willing to die quietly. The air was thick with smoke and the echo of distant shellfire. Snow fell in slow, delicate flakes, turning to ash as it touched the burning wreckage of what had once been homes. Within that circle of frozen ruin, men moved like shadows, tired, hollow-eyed, bound by a single unspoken command: hold. The 20 tanks that had once been frozen corpses were now the defenders' only shield. Their engines growled with the rough, uneven rhythm of desperation, held together by copper sleeves, hope, and a miracle that had no allegiance. Sergeant Wallace, who had led the repairs with the German prisoner, stood on the turret of his Sherman, scanning the tree line through the smoky haze. The men had no illusions. The Germans were coming again, in force. The sound of their armor echoed faintly in the distance, like thunder crawling closer with every heartbeat. Inside the repair yard, Friedrich Adler sat on an overturned fuel drum, his face half lit by the dull orange glow of a nearby fire. The Americans had not released him, but neither did they treat him as a prisoner any. He wore a heavy coat borrowed from one of the mechanics, its fabric still stiff with frost and grease. His hands ached from the labor of the past day, but he could still feel the hum of the engines vibrating faintly through the ground, a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat. Each rumble was proof that his makeshift trick had worked, that copper and faith could defy the cold. Yet, in the silence between explosions, guilt gnawed at him. He thought of the men in grey who were advancing through the woods, men who might have been his friends, his comrades once. He had no hatred for them, nor for the American. The war had devoured everything that once defined sides. It left only those who wanted to live and those who didn't care anymore. And as he sat there, the irony was not lost on him. A German had saved the tanks that would now destroy German tanks. He wondered if God laughed at such things, or if he too had gone silent under the snow. The first barrage came before dawn. The forest trembled as German artillery began to pound the American lines, each shell bursting with a scream that tore through the sky. The ground shook, trees splintered, snow and earth exploded upward like geysers of frozen mud. Men ducked behind their tanks, praying that the steel beasts would hold. Sergeant Wallace barked orders, his voice drowned by the storm of sound, but his men moved with the practiced rhythm of soldiers who had lived too long on the edge of death. The tanks rolled forward, their treads grinding over ice and corpses, their cannons belching flame. Friedrich stood among the mechanics, watching the machines he had resurrected come to life like creatures of legend. Each one thundered past, shaking the ground beneath his feet, their armor scarred but unbroken. He felt pride and dread. Pride in what his hands had made possible. Dread in knowing what. The Americans fought with ferocity, born of desperation, their tanks roaring like beasts awakened. And somewhere in that mechanical chorus, Friedrich heard the cry of something almost holy, a defiance that transcended nations, a simple refusal to die. The battle consumed the day. Smoke blanketed the valley, blotting out the sun, turning noon into twilight. The sound was unbearable, metal shrieking against metal, the crash of cannon fire, the dying cries of men swallowed by the roar of engines. Friedrich found himself running between the disabled tanks, his instincts overriding his fear. He carried tools, shouted directions, pointed out where fuel lines cracked or pressure failed. No one questioned him now. He was no longer the prisoner. He was the mechanic, the man who kept the tanks alive while the world burned around them. At one point, a Sherman near the tree line took a direct hit. The explosion threw Friedrich backward, the shockwave stealing his breath. When he rose, ears ringing, he saw the tank smoking, but not yet dead. The copper line had ruptured. The crew inside screamed for help. Without thinking, Friedrich stumbled forward through the snow and flame, crawling beneath the wreck as bullets snapped overhead. He could smell fuel, hot and metallic, mixing with the acrid stench of cordite. Working with trembling fingers, he jammed a new piece of copper into place, sealing the line. His vision blurred from smoke and heat, his lungs clawing for air. But when the engine roared again, he laughed, a wild, broken sound swallowed by the storm. By nightfall, the attack had faltered. The German advance slowed, beaten back by the stubborn defense of men who refused to yield. The 20 tanks, patched, improvised, scarred, still stood. Some were burning, others crippled, but enough remained to hold the line. The snow around Bastogne was black with soot, red with blood, littered with twisted steel and frozen bodies. Yet through it all, the faint hum of engines endured. the sound of survival carved into the silence. Friedrich collapsed near the repair yard, his coat scorched, his face streaked with grime. The sergeant found him there, half conscious, clutching a wrench like a weapon. He knelt beside the German, eyes heavy with respect that no words could express. "You saved a lot of men today," Wallace said quietly. Friedrich looked up at him, dazed, unsure whether to smile or weep. "I saved the engines," he whispered. "The men saved themselves." Then he leaned back against the snow, closing his eyes as the night swallowed the last light of the battle. Outside Bastogne, the forest still burned. The wind carried the smell of oil and smoke through the frozen branches, and somewhere among the dying embers, 20 tanks stood in silent formation, their copper hearts still beating. When the guns finally fell silent, the world felt hollow, as if sound itself had been wounded. The smoke hung low over Bastogne, curling lazily above the ruins and the broken trees that jutted from the snow like shattered bone. The smell was unbearable: oil, ash, and the iron scent of blood that clung to every breath. For days, the men of the 101st and the armoured units had lived like ghosts in that inferno, fighting not only the enemy but the cold, the hunger, and the creeping madness of exhaustion. Now, as the battle subsided, there was no cheering, no celebration, only the uneasy quiet that comes after too much death. Friedrich Adler lay in a field hospital tent that stank of antiseptic and smoke. His hands were bandaged, the skin of his palms burned and torn from handling hot metal in the middle of battle. His eyes blinked against the dim light filtering through the canvas. Around him, wounded Americans groaned in restless sleep, their bodies swathed in white bandages that made them look like spectres of their former selves. He did not belong there, not truly. He was still a prisoner of war, yet no one had the will to treat him like one. The guards nodded to him when they passed, and the doctors, though curt, tended to his wounds with the same weary compassion they gave to all the others. In war's aftermath, distinctions faded quickly. He sat up slowly, feeling the ache in his ribs where the blast had thrown him. His mind drifted back to the tanks, those 20 roaring beasts that had defied the cold and the chaos. He wondered how many still stood, how many of the men who had worked beside him still breathed. He could hear the faint rumble of engines outside, the surviving Shermans idling as if unwilling to rest. Their muffled growl was a comfort. It was the sound of something that had endured, something human preserved within the steel. Sergeant Wallace entered the tent, his uniform torn and blackened with soot. He carried himself with the tired dignity of a man who had looked death in the eye and decided to keep walking anyway. In his hand, he held a dented canteen, half filled with coffee that smelled faintly of smoke and metal. He handed it to Friedrich without a word. The German took it hesitantly, sipping the bitter liquid as if it were sacred. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, snow fell again, soft, silent, covering the blackened earth as though the sky itself was trying to forget what it had seen. Finally, Wallace broke the silence. "Those tanks," he said, his voice low and rasped from days of shouting through the smoke. "They held because of you." Friedrich shook his head weakly. "They held because your men refused to give up," he answered. "Engines don't fight, men do." Wallace studied him, then smiled faintly. The kind of smile that comes not from joy, but from understanding. "Maybe so, but it takes both to survive." In the days that followed, Bastogne became a monument to resilience. Reinforcements broke through the encirclement, bringing food, fuel, and the promise of survival. The wounded were evacuated, the dead buried beneath the snow, and the living went about the grim work of repairing what could be repaired. Not just tanks and roads, but the fragile machinery of their own spirit. Friedrich remained in the camp under guard, though his world had changed completely. Soldiers who had once looked at him with suspicion now nodded in greeting. Some even asked him questions about their tanks, and he answered quietly, his voice still rough but sure. At night, when the fires burned low and the men huddled for warmth, he could hear them telling the story, the German POW who saved 20 tanks. Each retelling grew larger, grander, until it sounded less like fact and more like legend. Friedrich would smile faintly when he heard it. He did not see himself as a hero. He had simply done what he was born to do, listen to engines, understand their language, and keep them alive. But he could not escape the strange comfort that came with knowing that, for once, his hands had built something that saved lives instead of taking. A week later, orders came to transfer the prisoners further south, away from the front. The war was still raging beyond the forest, but the tide had turned. Wallace came to see Friedrich before he left. They stood together beside one of the surviving Shermans, its armour still scarred from battle, the copper sleeve in its fuel line glinting faintly in the winter sun. "They'll probably never believe it back home," Wallace said quietly. That we learned a trick from a German who fixed our tanks. Friedrich looked at the machine, tracing the line with his eyes, and replied softly, engines don't care who wins the war. They only care who listens. The sergeant extended his hand. For a moment, Friedrich hesitated, then clasped it firmly. The gesture was brief, silent, and heavy with meaning. There were no flags, no speeches, no forgiveness spoken aloud. Only the quiet understanding between two men who had survived the same storm from opposite sides. As the convoy of prisoners rolled out of Bastogne, Friedrich looked back one last. The town was still smoking, still scarred, but alive. The sound of engines echoed faintly across the valley, the same engines he had helped revive. He thought of the men who would return home because of them, the lives those machines would carry forward into the next battle and the next. War would not end today or tomorrow, but something inside him had changed irrevocably. The world had shown him that even in the deepest cruelty of winter, a small act of creation could stand against destruction. And somewhere behind him, in the frozen silence of the Ardennes, the tanks kept their vigil, 20 copper-hearted beasts guarding a town that refused to die, their engines humming like prayers whispered into the endless snow. The train groaned through the grey expanse of winter, its wheels screaming over the rails like a wounded animal, dragging itself toward an uncertain fate. Inside the crowded freight car, the air was heavy with the stench of sweat, damp wool, and fear. Dozens of German prisoners sat huddled together, wrapped in whatever rags they had managed to. Frost rimed the edges of the wooden boards, and the cold crept in like a slow poison, numbing fingers, then thought. Among them sat Friedrich Adler, silent, his eyes fixed on the small gap of light that flickered through a crack in the door. The rhythmic clatter of the train was a heartbeat of captivity, steady and inescapable. He had left Bastogne behind, the smoke, the ruins, the 20 tanks that had become legend in whispers. The Americans had treated him fairly, even respectfully, but now that the battle was over, the machinery of war had resumed its order. Prisoners were prisoners, regardless of what they had done. Friedrich understood this. He did not resent it. He had lived long enough to know that justice and fairness rarely shared the same trench. What he felt instead was an emptiness that defied language, the hollow space that opens when purpose is stripped away, when the hands that once built are forced to remain still. When the train finally stopped, it was night. The prisoners were marched out under the dim glow of lanterns, their boots crunching on frozen mud. A sign on the gate read Camp Halsey, though the name meant nothing to them. Rows of barracks stretched into the darkness, their outlines softened by the snow. The air smelled faintly of pine and burnt coal. Friedrich's breath rose before him in thin clouds as he was herded inside a wooden building, where the cold followed like an uninvited ghost. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Work details, thin rations, the endless cold. Yet the Americans who ran the camp were different from the faceless cruelty he had imagined. Some were stern, others indifferent, a few even kind. They did not beat the prisoners. They spoke to them, sometimes shared cigarettes, sometimes silent. Friedrich found himself assigned to the motor pool, repairing jeeps, trucks, and generators. The irony did not escape him. Even as a captive, he was bound to machines. But it was a strange comfort. The scent of oil and metal was familiar, grounding him when everything else had been taken away. The American mechanics soon realized what kind of man they had. He could diagnose an engine by sound alone, repair a transmission with nothing but wire and instinct. They began to seek him out, asking his opinion, trading him small favors, an extra slice of bread, a scrap of tobacco, a story about home. Friedrich answered their questions in broken English, his voice quiet but sure. They called him Doc, a nickname born of respect, and it followed him through the winter like a fragile warmth. But captivity had its own battle, quieter, more corrosive. Some of the German prisoners still clung to the Reich's delusions, whispering about loyalty and vengeance, accusing men like Friedrich of betrayal. They called him a collaborator, a traitor to his blood. He ignored them at first, burying himself in the work. But one night, as the camp slept under the heavy silence of falling snow, 2 men cornered him behind the workshop. Their faces were gaunt, eyes wild with pride and hunger. They called him Verräter, traitor, and struck him. The blow split his lip, sent him sprawling against the frozen earth. He did not fight back. He simply looked at them, the way one might look at ghosts. They hesitated, seeing no hatred in his gaze, only exhaustion. One of them muttered something and left. The other spat and followed. When morning came, Friedrich's mouth bled and his ribs ached. but he returned to work as if nothing had happened. The American sergeant in charge of the motor pool, a broad man from Ohio named McCarthy, noticed the bruises but said nothing. Instead, he handed Friedrich a wrench and a mug of coffee. "Some people only know one kind of war," McCarthy said quietly. "You don't have to fight it with them." Friedrich nodded. He didn't have the words to explain that he had already left that war behind. His battle was now with silence, the long, slow test of surviving without losing one's soul. Spring crept reluctantly into the camp. The snow melted, revealing mud and the faint color of new grass. The prisoners' faces grew less pale, their eyes less hollow. Rumors began to drift in, whispers of the Allies closing in on Berlin, of Hitler cornered, of an ending that no one could quite believe. Friedrich worked through it all, fixing the engines that carried supplies to the front. The irony of it never lost on him. He no longer thought in terms of sides. He thought only of the rhythm of machines, the fragile peace that lived between one heartbeat and the next. Then, one afternoon, a jeep pulled into the yard, its driver unfamiliar. McCarthy motioned Friedrich over. "You got a visitor," he said with a half smile. From the passenger seat stepped Sergeant Wallace, the man from Bastogne. His uniform was cleaner now, his face less haunted, but the same quiet strength lingered in his eyes. He extended his hand again, the same as before, and Friedrich took it. "I heard you were here," Wallace said. "I thought I owed you something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gleaming object, a piece of copper tubing, polished and folded into a rough ring, from one of the tanks, the one that made it back home. Friedrich turned the ring in his fingers, the metal warm from Wallace's hand. "It's not beautiful," the sergeant said, smiling faintly, "but it's real." Friedrich looked at it for a long time before slipping it into his pocket. "Beauty," he said softly, "is what survives." The two men stood in the fading light, surrounded by the quiet murmur of the camp. For a brief, impossible moment, there was no war, only two men who had crossed through fire and cold and found a fragment of humanity on the other side. And as the evening fell over Camp Halsey, the sound of distant engines drifted through the air, a reminder that even in captivity, the pulse of life continued to hum beneath the ruins. The guns stopped before the hatred did. The world declared victory. The newspapers spoke of peace. But in the hearts of those who had survived, the war kept whispering, in the corners of sleep, in the sudden silence of mornings that no longer began with sirens or orders. Friedrich Adler felt it most in his hands, the way they trembled even when holding nothing, as if the echoes of engines still vibrated in his bones. The day the Americans announced Germany's surrender, the camp fell quiet, almost reverent. Some of the prisoners wept openly. Others stared into the distance as though watching a country vanish. A few shouted in rage, clinging to the last threads of a delusion that had already turned to ash. Friedrich simply stood still, feeling the cold wind on his face, and whispered a prayer for the world to start again. The weeks that followed were slow, uncertain. The war had ended, but the machinery of it had not yet stopped turning. Paperwork, repatriation, bureaucracy, all moved with the pace of winter thawing from stone. Friedrich worked in the motor pool until the very last day, repairing engines he would never drive again, maintaining trucks that would soon belong to peacekeepers instead of soldiers. He did it without complaint. Work was the only rhythm that made sense. It kept the ghosts at bay. One morning, an American lieutenant arrived at the camp gates with a clipboard and a list of names. The prisoners were being released in groups. When the guard called Adler Friedrich, he almost didn't recognize his own name. He packed what little he owned, a small tin of tobacco, a ragged notebook filled with sketches of engines, and the copper ring Sergeant Wallace had given him. He carried no bitterness, no longing for home. Home was a word that had burned away in the war. What awaited him in Germany he did not know. Only ruins, perhaps, and silence. The train journey back was quieter than the one that had brought him. The countryside slid past in shades of grey and green, the forests blooming again, the rivers swollen with melted snow. Every village he passed bore scars, walls shattered, fields cratered, roofs torn away like scabs from a healing wound. The war had written itself into the land as surely as it had into the souls of the men returning to it. When he finally reached his hometown near Kassel, the station was half collapsed, its sign charred and unreadable. The air smelled of rain and dust. Friedrich walked through the empty streets that had once been filled with laughter and market cries. He found his family's old workshop, its roof caved in, its tools scattered and rusted. His mother was gone. He learned from a neighbor that she had died during a bombing the previous year. There were no graves, no ceremony, just absence. He stood in the ruins of his life and felt the weight of it press against his chest until he could barely breathe. For days he wandered the town in silence, helping where he could, fixing pumps, mending bicycles, repairing the old engines of farm tractors that had survived the war better than their owners. People began to know him again, not as the soldier or the prisoner, but as the mechanic. Children watched him work, wide-eyed, as if he were coaxing ghosts out of the metal. In a world that had forgotten how to build, his skill became a kind of resurrection. Months passed. The Americans withdrew, replaced by the slow machinery of reconstruction. One afternoon, as he worked beneath a tractor in the fading light, he heard footsteps behind him. When he rose, wiping grease from his hands, he saw a familiar figure, Sergeant Wallace, older now, wearing civilian clothes, a suitcase in one hand. The sight hit him like the sudden warmth of a forgotten sun. "I was stationed near Frankfurt," Wallace said, smiling faintly. "Heard there was a mechanic here who could make a dead engine breathe again. I thought it sounded familiar." They sat together in the workshop amid the scent of oil and old wood, speaking in broken sentences and long silences. Wallace told him about life after the war, the confusion, the parades, the quiet sorrow that came when the cheering stopped. "You think peace will heal you," he said softly, "but sometimes it just gives you the time to feel the wounds." Friedrich nodded, his eyes distant. "Peace," he murmured, "is a different kind of endurance." When Wallace left, he pressed something into Friedrich's hand, a small envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation and a simple message. "There's a place in Antwerp rebuilding trucks. They need men who can listen to engines. Men like you." For the first time in years, Friedrich smiled. It was faint, fragile, but real. He looked around at the ruined workshop, at the broken tools, the walls still pockmarked by shrapnel, and felt the stirrings of something almost forgotten, hope. He would leave Germany behind, not to escape it, but to begin again. The war would remain with him, yes, in the burns on his hands, and the nights when sleep turned to fire and noise. But he would build something new over it, layer by layer, gear by gear, until the memory became machinery, something that could move forward. And so, when he boarded the train to Belgium weeks later, he carried nothing but his tools, his notebook, and the copper ring that glinted faintly in the light. The landscape outside the window blurred into green and grey and the occasional ruin, but Friedrich did not look back. Behind him lay the silence of the past. Ahead, the soft hum of engines waiting to be reborn. Years passed, like slow rivers, carrying fragments of the old world downstream. Europe healed, but not quickly, and not completely. Cities rose again from ashes, their new walls built atop the bones of the old, and the sound of hammers and saws replaced that of artillery. For Friedrich Adler, life became a quieter war, one fought against silence, against the pull of memory. He worked in Antwerp first, repairing trucks for an Allied logistics company, and then, as borders softened and nations learned to speak again, he opened his own small workshop at the edge of the city. Its sign was simple, Adler and Sons, though he had no sons, only a handful of apprentices who came to him seeking work and stayed for something more profound, a kind of peace that smelled of grease and oil and the quiet satisfaction of creation. He never spoke of Bastogne unless asked. When he did, his voice would grow soft, his eyes distant, as if he were looking through the smoke of another time. He would tell them not of glory or heroism, but of men, cold, hungry, afraid, and of engines that refused to die because someone had listened closely enough. He told them that in the heart of destruction, he had discovered something strange and sacred, the idea that even the smallest act of repair is an act of defiance against chaos. His apprentices would listen in silence, some not fully understanding, but feeling, in his tone, that these were words meant to be remembered. The copper ring he'd been given never left his hand. It dulled over the years, the edges smoothed by time, but he still wore it, a reminder not of what he had done, but of what had been possible between enemies, when survival demanded humanity. Visitors who noticed it sometimes asked about its origin, and he would smile faintly and say, "A piece of a tank that should never have lived." In the autumn of 1957, long after Europe had found its footing again, a letter arrived at his shop. The handwriting was uneven but familiar, the deliberate, heavy strokes of Sergeant Wallace. Friedrich read it by lamplight, as rain tapped gently against the window. Wallace wrote of America, of a farm in Pennsylvania where the nights were quiet, where he sometimes still dreamed of the Ardennes. "I can still hear the engines, Fritz," the letter said. "Every winter when the wind hits the barn doors, it sounds like those tanks waking up again. I reckon some things never really stop moving once they've been brought back to life." Friedrich folded the letter carefully and slipped it between the pages of his old notebook. That night, he stepped outside into the cool air and looked up at the stars. The same sky that had watched men kill and forgive, now stretched wide and calm above the rebuilt wall. He closed his eyes and listened. In the distance, a passing truck growled faintly, its engine steady and alive, and for a brief, beautiful moment, it sounded like Bastogne again, not the battle, but the heartbeat that had risen from it. As the years deepened, his hands grew slower, his eyesight dimmer, but he continued to work, always with patience, always with reverence for the fragile harmony between man and machine. When he finally grew too weak to lift a wrench, his apprentices continued his work. They called him der Hörer, the listener, because even in old age he could still tell what an engine needed just by hearing it breathe. He passed away quietly in his sleep one winter morning, the same way the snow used in the Ardennes, softly, without sound, covering everything it touched with peace. On the workbench beside him lay the copper ring, his tools neatly arranged and the faint smell of oil lingering like incense. His apprentices kept the shop open, its sign unaltered, and beneath it they engraved a small plaque. He taught us to build what endures. Years later, when a journalist researching the Battle of the Bulge found his name in a faded American report, the story of the German prisoner who saved 20 tanks resurfaced. It spread quietly at first, a footnote, a rumor, and then grew into legend. Veterans spoke of him at reunions, engineers cited him as a parable of ingenuity, and mechanics across Europe told the tale of a man who found redemption not in victory, but in repair. In a museum near Bastogne, among the rusted relics of the Ardennes offensive, there now stands a Sherman tank with a small inscription beside its hull. It reads, "Engine modified during siege, saved by a German mechanic named Friedrich Adler." Visitors who pause to read it often do so in silence. Some smile, some wipe their eyes, and in the stillness that follows, if one listens closely, it's almost possible to hear it. The faint hum of an engine turning once more, the sound of mercy hidden within machinery, the echo of one man's quiet defiance against the darkness of his time. And so the legend endures, not as a story of war, but of what can survive it. If this ending touched you, take a moment to reflect. And if you believe stories like Friedrich's deserve to live on, like and subscribe to, keep these forgotten hearts of history beating.